The hatchling was already bleeding when they brought it through the clinic door. I know that because I was standing at the supply cabinet counting suture kits, 14 remaining, 12 of them expired, when the sound hit me. Not a cry, not the thin wail of something small and hurt. It was a vibration, subvocal, the kind you feel in your molars before your ears register it, and it rattled every glass vial on the shelf hard enough to make 3 of them walk off the edge and shatter on the floor. Corporal Essen kicked the door open with his boot, both arms full. Medic found it in the ravine behind the fuel dump, wings torn. Leg might be broken. He deposited the creature on my examination table, a slab of brushed steel that had been designed for human soldiers, and was not remotely adequate for what was now lying on it. The hatchling was the size of a large dog, maybe 40 pounds. Its scales, a mottled dark green that shifted to bronze at the edges where they caught the overhead lights. Its wings membraned, translucent near the tips, webbed with fine veins that pulsed a faint amber, were folded tight against its body, except for the left one, which hung at an angle that told me the joint was either dislocated or shattered. Blood, darker than human blood, almost black, with a faint iridescence, pooled beneath the damaged wing and dripped off the table edge onto my freshly mopped floor. Its eyes were open, gold with vertical pupils, fixed on me with an intensity that had nothing to do with trust and everything to do with assessment. It was deciding whether I was a threat. "I'm a field medic," I said, already reaching for gloves despite myself. "Not a veterinarian, not a dragon handler. I stitch up soldiers with heat stroke and infected blisters. This is Waystation 34, Corporal. We're a fuel and water stop for convoy vehicles. We don't have dragon facilities." Essen wiped blood off his forearms with a rag that was already saturated. "Nearest dragon station is Waystation 19. That's a 14-hour drive through the Valkith Pass, and the pass has been closed for rockslides since Tuesday. Airfield at Caldera South is grounded, 3 transports down for engine overhaul." I radioed it in. "Command says hold the asset and wait for pickup." "How long?" "They didn't say. Could be days, could be a week." I looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked at me. Its breathing was rapid and shallow, each exhale carrying a faint hiss of what might have been pain or might have been warning. The torn wing membrane was still oozing, not arterial. The blood was too dark and too slow for that, but steady enough that it would matter in an hour if I didn't close it. A second laceration, smaller, ran along the base of the right forelimb where something sharp, rock, wire, maybe a fragment of whatever vehicle had been involved, had peeled back a strip of scale and exposed the pinkish underlayer. "It's not my job," I said. "No, ma'am. I don't know dragon anatomy. I don't know their pain responses. I don't know what anesthetics are safe for them, or what their blood does when it meets human-grade antiseptic." "No, ma'am." The hatchling made a sound, not the subvocal rattle from before, something smaller, higher, a thin keening note that came from the back of its throat and cut through every clinical objection I had just listed. It sounded exactly like what it was, a child, alone, in pain and frightened. I pulled on the gloves. "My name is Leon Avery. I was 46 years old when the hatchling arrived at Waystation 34, and I had been stationed there for 11 months, which was 10 months longer than I had wanted to be. The posting was supposed to be temporary, a rotation assignment, 4 weeks of low-traffic clinic duty in the arid belt south of the Cathara Range, where the convoys refueled, and the worst medical emergency in a typical week was a sprained ankle or a case of sun poisoning. I was a trauma nurse by training, 12 years at Caldera General before the reassignment, and the move to Waystation 34 had been framed as a rest period after a bad year. The kind of rest period that comes with a gentle suggestion from your supervisor that perhaps you've been working too many shifts, and perhaps the edge in your voice during handoffs has been noticed, and perhaps some time away from the trauma ward would help you recalibrate. I did not want to recalibrate, I wanted to work. Work was the thing that kept everything else at arm's length, the grief that had been sitting in my chest for 2 years since my daughter's accident, the numbness that had replaced the grief, the quiet realization that numbness was not the same as healing, and that I had been confusing the two for longer than I wanted to admit. Waystation 34 was supposed to be a holding pattern. I would do my time, submit my transfer paperwork, and go back to the real work at Caldera General, where there were enough emergencies to fill every waking hour and enough exhaustion to guarantee dreamless sleep. Instead, there was a hatchling bleeding on my table, and the gloves were already on, and the suture kit was already in my hand. I started with the wing. The membrane was thinner than I expected, almost translucent, with a texture somewhere between wet silk and the skin of a very ripe plum. The tear was ragged, 4 inches long, running parallel to the third vein from the leading edge. The edges were swollen and hot to the touch, which meant inflammation was already setting in, which meant I had maybe 2 hours before the tissue started to contract and the tear became permanent. I had no dragon-specific supplies. I had what any field clinic stocks: sterile saline, lidocaine, silk sutures, antiseptic wash, gauze, tape, and a portable lamp that buzzed like an angry wasp when you tilted it past 45 degrees. I used the saline to irrigate the wound, watching the dark blood thin and run clear, then pink, then clear again. The hatchling flinched when the cold fluid hit the torn tissue but did not pull away. Its gold eyes tracked my hands with that same assessing stare, and I realized with a start that it was watching my technique, not just my presence, but the specific way I held the irrigation syringe, the angle of the stream, the pressure. It was learning. "Hold still," I said. "This is going to sting." I applied lidocaine to the wound margins. I had no idea if it would work on draconic tissue, whether it would cause an allergic reaction or interfere with their healing, or do nothing at all. What I knew was that the hatchling was in pain, and I was about to push a needle through the edge of its wing, and if there was a chance the lidocaine would take the edge off, I was going to use it. 3 minutes after application, the hatchling's breathing slowed. The rigid tension in its body softened by a degree. The pupils, which had been wide and black with distress, contracted to thin gold-rimmed slits. The lidocaine was working, or something was. I sutured the tear with silk thread, the smallest gauge I had, using the same interrupted technique I used on facial lacerations in the trauma ward: small bites, close spacing, minimal tension. The membrane was more cooperative than human skin. It held the sutures without tearing through, and the edges aligned cleanly, as though the tissue wanted to be whole and just needed someone to hold it in place while it remembered how. 12 sutures, 22 minutes. The hatchling trembled twice during the process, but did not jerk away. Each time I paused, waited for the trembling to pass, and resumed. By the time I tied off the last one, the hatchling had stopped keening. Its breathing had settled into a slow, steady rhythm, and its head had lowered to the table surface, one eye still open, still watching. The forelimb laceration was simpler. I debrided the loose scale. It came away cleanly, like a fingernail peeled from its bed, irrigated the exposed tissue, applied antiseptic, and bandaged it with gauze and tape. The leg itself I palpated joint by joint. Not broken, the bones were intact. The ligaments held, but the right hind leg carried a deep bruise that made the hatchling hiss when I pressed the medial aspect of the knee. I wrapped it with a compression bandage, secured it, and added a cold pack from the clinic's meager supply. Then I stood back and looked at what I had done. A dragon hatchling, sutured and bandaged, lying on a human examination table in a fuel-stop clinic in the middle of nowhere, watched over by a nurse who had not wanted to be here and had not wanted this patient and was now, despite every intention, responsible for it. "Temporary," I said to the empty room. The hatchling's tail curled once slowly against the steel. The first night was logistical. I had no enclosure suitable for a dragon. The clinic had 3 rooms: the examination bay, a supply closet, and my quarters, a narrow space with a cot, a footlocker, and a window that looked out onto the fuel yard. The hatchling could not stay on the examination table. It was steel, cold at night when the desert temperature dropped, and the table was 3 feet off the ground with no rails. I moved the supply crates out of the closet, laid down 3 folded blankets, and transferred the hatchling. It watched the transfer with wide, alert eyes, its claws clicking on the floor as it found its footing on the unfamiliar surface. And when I set the last blanket down and stepped back, it circled twice, exactly the way a dog circles before lying down, and the familiarity of the gesture hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for, then settled into the nest with its injured wing on top, elevated by the fold of the blanket. "Good," I said. "Stay." It stayed. I wrote up the intake log. 1 juvenile draconic specimen, approximate age unknown, sex unknown, weighed approximately 40 pounds, presenting with a torn left wing membrane sutured 12 silk stitches, a 4-limb laceration debrided bandaged, and a contusion to the right hind leg wrapped cold packed. Found in the ravine behind the fuel depot by Corporal Essen at 14:30 hours. No identification markings, no collar, no brand, no chip. Command notified. Awaiting pickup. I filed the log, turned off the light, and went to my quarters. I did not sleep. Through the thin wall I could hear the hatchling breathing, and beneath the breathing, so faint I might have imagined it, that subvocal hum, a vibration that crept through the drywall and into the frame of my cot, and settled into my bones like a second heartbeat. By morning I had convinced myself it was the plumbing. The pickup did not come. I radioed command at 600. The operator, a bored private at Caldera South, told me the pass was still closed, the airfield still grounded, and Dragon handling resources were deployed to the northern range for an exercise that would last another week. My priority ticket had been logged, but the queue was long and waystation 34 was at the bottom. The asset was classified as non-priority. A juvenile with non-life-threatening injuries did not qualify for expedited extraction. "It's a baby," I said. "Ma'am, the classification is based on threat level and strategic value. A juvenile without known lineage or military designation is non-priority. It's a baby dragon alone in a fuel-stop clinic with a nurse who doesn't know how to feed it." "Understood. Your ticket is in the queue. Command recommends standard field rations until specialized nutrition can be arranged." I hung up. The hatchling was awake. It had rearranged the blankets during the night, pushing them into a mound against the back wall of the closet and hollowing out a depression in the center, a nest within a nest. When I crouched down to check the sutures, holding well, no sign of infection, the membrane edges already showing the faintest pink blush of new cell growth. The hatchling extended its neck and pressed the flat of its snout against my palm. The scales were warm, not the ambient warmth of a body at rest, genuinely warm, a radiant heat that came from somewhere deep inside the creature and pushed outward through the tissue like coals banked beneath ash. I held still. The hatchling held still. For perhaps 10 seconds we stayed like that, my hand against its face, its eyes closed, its breathing slow, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. The sensation of being identified by another living thing, as someone who would not cause harm. I pulled my hand back. "Breakfast," I said, and want to figure out what to feed a dragon. The answer, as it turned out, was everything. Waystation 34's kitchen was stocked for 20 soldiers on rotation. I had been the only permanent staff for 3 months, and the pantry was a combination of military rations, canned goods, and whatever the supply truck dropped off every 2 weeks. The hatchling rejected the protein bars outright, nosing them off the plate with a dismissive flick. It rejected the canned meat, which I could not blame it for. It showed mild interest in the dried fruit, ate 3 strips of jerky with efficient, unhurried bites. And then, when I opened a can of fish, sardines in oil, the emergency ration nobody ever touched, It made a sound I can only describe as reverent and ate the entire can in 4 seconds, tin included. Not the tin, I said too late. It looked at me, licked its jaw. The tin had already been swallowed. I checked its abdomen for distension over the next hour. Nothing. Apparently dragon digestive systems handle tin cans with the same indifference they handle everything else. I radioed command again that evening. Same answer, the cue, the pass, the exercise, non-priority. I need nutritional guidance at minimum, I said. What do juvenile dragons eat? How often? How much? Ma'am, that information would be available from the Draconic Handling Division at Caldera North, but they're currently deployed to the Northern Range. Yes, I know. I hung up and fed the hatchling another can of sardines. It ate the sardines and left the tin this time, which I chose to interpret as progress. The first 3 days were clinical. I checked the sutures twice daily, monitored the wing membrane for infection, changed the forelimb bandage, replaced the leg wrap when the compression loosened, tracked its temperature by touch. I had no thermometer calibrated for draconic baseline, so I measured by comparison to the previous check, warmer or cooler, and logged it in a notebook because the standard intake forms did not have fields for any of this. I kept my interactions functional. In, check, treat, out, professional distance. The same emotional perimeter I had maintained in the trauma ward, where attachment to a patient was a liability and detachment was a survival skill. The hatchling did not cooperate with my perimeter. On day 2, it followed me out of the closet. I had left the door open while I restocked the supply cabinet, and I turned around to find it sitting in the middle of the examination bay, its injured wing held carefully off the ground, its head tilted at an angle that managed to convey both curiosity and something uncomfortably close to expectation. It had walked on 3 legs, favoring the bruised one, with a careful, deliberate gait that suggested intelligence beyond anything I had been briefed on. Which was nothing. Nobody briefs a field medic on dragon behavior. Go back, I said, pointing at the closet. It looked at my pointing hand. Then it looked at the cabinet I was restocking. Then it looked back at me and made a soft churring sound, a rolling purr in the back of its throat, and walked past me to investigate the bottom shelf. It nosed through the bandage rolls, sniffed the antiseptic bottles, and spent a full minute examining the portable lamp with the air of a mechanic assessing unfamiliar equipment. Then it returned to where I stood, sat down at my feet, and looked up at me with an expression that said quite clearly, "Continue." On day 3, it found the heating pad. I had left it charging on the counter, standard issue, for muscle strains, and the hatchling discovered it during one of its increasingly frequent explorations. It pressed its snout against the pad, felt the warmth, and curled its entire body around it with the boneless contentment of a creature that had found exactly what it needed. I tried to reclaim it. The hatchling opened one eye, looked at me with an expression that conveyed with perfect clarity that the heating pad was now its property, and closed the eye again. I ordered a second heating pad from the supply truck. That night I sat at the desk writing my daily log, and became aware that the hatchling had moved from the heating pad to the foot of my chair. Not touching me, it maintained a careful 6 inches of distance, as if measuring the exact boundary of my tolerance, but close enough that I could feel the radiant warmth of its body against my ankle. I wrote 3 more lines. It did not move. I wrote 4 more. It settled its chin onto the floor and the subvocal hum started again, low and constant, like a generator running beneath the building's foundation. I finished the log, filed it, and sat for a moment in the quiet. The hum was not unpleasant. It was, if I was being honest, the closest thing to companionship I had experienced in 11 months. I did not move my ankle. On day 4, it started sleeping against my door. I discovered this at 5:30, when I opened my quarters to begin the morning rounds and nearly stepped on 40 pounds of sleeping dragon curled against the threshold. Its breathing was deep, and even the damaged wing draped over its body like a blanket. And when my boot scuffed the floor, it opened both eyes, looked up at me, and made that churring sound, the one that was becoming familiar, the one that meant, in whatever language dragons speak, something I was trying very hard not to translate. "You have a bed," I said, "in the closet with blankets." It stood up, shook itself, a full-body ripple that started at the head and traveled to the tail tip, sending a fine spray of scale dust into the air, and followed me to the examination bay. It did not go back to the closet that night, or any night after. On day 5, the supply truck came through. Halley's, the civilian contractor who ran the bi-weekly route through the southern stations, stopped in the doorway of the clinic and stared. "Is that a dragon?" "Yes." "In your clinic?" "Yes." "It's eating fish off a plate." I had started plating the hatchling's food. A concession to dignity, it seemed to prefer eating from a surface rather than from the tin, and the careful way it picked the sardines off the ceramic, one at a time, with the tips of its front claws, had a precision that demanded a certain respect. "I need more sardines," I said, "and whatever fresh fish you can get from the Cathara market, whole fish, small ones. Also another heating pad, 3 extra blankets, and do you have access to any veterinary reference materials? Anything at all on draconic physiology?" Halley's was still staring. "I can ask around. The fish market might have something. The old vet in Cathara town used to treat the draft breeds that work the quarries. He might have notes." "Get the notes." He got the notes. They arrived on the next supply run, a water-stained binder of handwritten observations from a retired quarry veterinarian who had treated draconic laborers for 30 years. The information was basic: feeding schedules, common ailments, baseline temperatures, the critical importance of warmth for juveniles whose internal furnace had not yet fully developed. But it was more than I had, and I read the entire binder in one sitting while the hatchling dozed on its heating pad at my feet. On day 5, I also gave it a name. I didn't mean to. I had been calling it the hatchling in my logs and you in conversation, and the patient in my radio updates to command. What happened was this. I was replacing 2 sutures that had dissolved faster than silk should, which meant the hatchling's body chemistry ran more acidic than human baseline, a fact I logged for future reference. I was irrigating the replacement site when the hatchling flinched hard, a full-body jerk that nearly knocked the syringe out of my hand, and I heard myself say, without thinking, "Easy, Keithra. Easy." I don't know where the name came from. It was not a name I had heard before. It was not my daughter's name, or anyone's name from any part of my life I could trace. It arrived the way some things arrive, fully formed, already true, as if it had been waiting for me to say it and was simply relieved that I finally had. The hatchling went still when I said it, not the frightened stillness of the first day, not the assessing stillness, a listening kind. Her head came up, because the name made the pronoun land, made the creature specific in a way it never had, and her gold eyes met mine, and she made a sound I had not heard before. A low, resonant note that was not a churr and not a keen, but something between, something that vibrated at a frequency I felt in my sternum, close to where the grief lived. And for one breath I forgot that I was a medic and she was a patient, and there was supposed to be a perimeter between us. "Keithra," I said again, and her tail curled. The sutures held, the name held, and the perimeter I understood had been breached. On day 6, the forelimb laceration closed. I removed the bandage to find new scales growing over the wound, tiny, pale, slightly translucent, like milk glass, but unmistakably scales. The tissue underneath was smooth and healthy. No scar, no trace of the injury except the faintest discoloration where the original scales had been peeled away. Draconic healing was faster and more precise than anything in my training, the body replacing not just tissue but the specific external structure, scale by scale, with a fidelity that would have taken a human wound weeks to approximate. I described it in the notebook, because the notebook had become the repository for everything the standard forms couldn't hold. By day 7, the wing was responding to the exercises I had adapted from the quarry vet's binder: gentle extensions, hold for 10 seconds, release, repeat. Each session yielded another degree of extension, another centimeter of recovered range. The bruised leg bore weight again, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Keithra moved through the clinic on 4 legs, her claws clicking on the tile, and by the end of the week she was testing small wing flutter extensions. An inch further each day, then 2, then a sudden flap that sent a stack of intake forms scattering off the desk and made her look so startled by her own capability that I laughed. I had not laughed in a long time. The sound surprised me. It surprised Keithra too. She cocked her head, studying the sound the way she studied everything I did, cataloging it, filing it away in whatever internal map she was building of this strange, reluctant creature who had stitched her wing and named her, and could not stop checking for the next small sign of healing. She was intelligent, more intelligent than I had any framework for. By the second week, she understood 30 words of common speech, not just commands but descriptions, objects, actions. She knew wing and leg and suture and careful and good and no and breakfast and fish and stay and come and outside. She understood gentle, a word I used when checking her wing, and would soften her body accordingly, relaxing the tension in the joint so I could palpate without resistance. She understood weight, and would hold position while I prepared the irrigation kit or heated the compress I had started applying to the wing joint each morning. She knew my name, or rather she knew a sound she made when she saw me, a 2-note call high-low that bore no resemblance to Leon but which served the same function. She made it when I entered a room, when I returned from the supply shed, when I woke in the morning. It meant, "There you are, I was waiting." I wrote that in the notebook too, not the clinical observation, the translation. The second week settled into a rhythm that I had not intended and could not bring myself to break. Morning started with the compress, warmed linen on the wing joint, 10 minutes, while Keithra leaned into the heat and made the low humming sound that I had come to understand was her version of contentment. Then the exercises, gentle extensions, measured by the angle marks I had drawn on the examination table with a grease pencil, each degree of progress logged in the notebook. Then breakfast, sardines, fresh fish when Hallie's supply run had come through, and the calcium supplement mixed into a paste that Keithra ate with the focused attention of a creature that understood, on some level, that the minerals were for her bones. After breakfast, she followed me through the day's work. If I cleaned the examination bay, she sat in the corner and watched, her head tracking the mop the way a cat tracks a string. If I inventoried supplies, she positioned herself under the counter and observed the count, occasionally nosing a box back into alignment when it had been placed at an angle she found unsatisfactory. If I sat at the radio desk, by this point merely going through the motions of the daily command check-in, she curled at my feet with her chin on my boot and waited for me to finish. And when I put the handset down, she would make the 2-note call and walk toward the door, which was her way of saying, "Enough of that, let's go outside." We went outside. The waystation yard was dusty and sun-bleached and had nothing to recommend it except space and light, and Keithra explored both with an appetite that grew daily. She stalked lizards along the fence line, never catching them, seemingly content with the pursuit. She dug shallow trenches in the gravel with her forelimbs, then lay in them with her wings spread to catch the sun, a basking behavior the quarry vet's notes described as essential for juvenile scale development. She discovered the water trough and spent 20 minutes investigating her own reflection, occasionally tapping the surface with her snout and watching the ripples with the intensity of a scientist conducting an experiment. I sat on the clinic step and watched her, and the watching felt like something I had forgotten how to do, not monitoring, not assessing, just watching a living thing discover its world. On day 8, I stopped calling command. It wasn't a decision, it was an absence of one. I woke at 5:30, stepped over Keithra, who had graduated from sleeping against my door to sleeping half inside my doorway, her snout resting on the threshold like a sentinel, and walked to the radio room. I sat down. I looked at the handset, and I understood with a clarity that felt like the first honest thing I had admitted in months that I did not want them to come. On day 9, the setback hit. I had been pushing the wing exercises. The quarry vet's notes recommended progressive loading for membrane injuries, and Keithra had been responding well. I was optimistic. That was the mistake. Optimism made me push the hold to 15 seconds on the third repetition, and the healing membrane, still fragile at the suture line, tore. Not badly. A micro tear, 2 millimeters at the junction of the old wound and the new growth. But the effect was immediate. Keithra jerked her wing back, pressed it tight against her body, and retreated to the far corner of the examination bay with her head low and her eyes on me. The expression in them was not pain. It was betrayal. I knew that look. I had seen it in the trauma ward, patients who had trusted the process and been hurt by it, who could not separate the person from the procedure, whose trust had been given provisionally and was now being reconsidered. It was the look that breaks you if you let it, the one that makes you doubt whether the work you're doing is help or harm. I sat down on the floor. Not near her, on the opposite side of the bay, my back against the cabinet, my legs stretched out on the tile. I did not approach. I did not speak. I sat and I waited, the way you wait when trust has been cracked and the only material that can repair it is time. 20 minutes, 30, 45. Keithra watched me the entire time, motionless, breathing controlled. At 45 minutes, her head lowered to the floor. At 50, her tail relaxed. At 60, she began the slow, careful walk across the bay toward me, 3 legs carrying her weight while the damaged wing stayed pressed against her side. When she reached me, she did not press her snout into my hand the way she usually did. She lay down beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off her body, and she rested her head on my knee. "I'm sorry," I said. She chirred that 2-note sound, "There you are." I modified the protocol. Shorter holds, longer recovery periods, no progression until I was certain the healing had caught up. I added a section to the notebook, Lessons from Failure. The first entry was 3 words long, Patience is treatment. The next 2 mornings, Keithra allowed the compress but turned her head away during the extension exercises, a quiet refusal that I did not override. On the 3rd morning after the setback, she initiated the extension herself, lifting the wing, testing the range, then turning to look at me with an expression that was neither permission nor request but something more collaborative. A negotiation. She would try if I would be careful. I would be careful. We began again, slower this time. I held the wing with both hands, supporting the membrane from below so the tissue bore no unsupported weight, and we moved through the range together in increments so small that an observer would have thought nothing was happening. But I could feel it, the tissue softening under the heat of the compress, the joint yielding a fraction of a degree, the membrane stretching and holding, stretching and holding. Keithra's breathing stayed even. Her eyes stayed on mine. Trust, rebuilt 1 millimeter at a time. The micro-tear closed in 2 days. On day 11, Keithra extended the wing to its widest spread yet nearly full extension, the membrane taut and luminous in the morning sunlight that came through the examination bay window, and held it there for a full 30 seconds before folding it back against her body with a control that had not been there a week ago. Her gold eyes found mine afterward, and the expression in them was not the watchful assessment of the early days or the hurt of the setback. It was pride, a child showing her work. "Good girl," I said, and the words landed in a place I had not visited in 2 years, the place where I used to say those words to someone else, and for the first time the grief in my chest did not feel like a stone. It felt like a door opening. On day 12, the crisis came. I was in the supply closet, reorganized now as a proper feed station, with labeled containers for the dried fish, the fresh fish from the Cathara market, and the calcium mineral supplement I had improvised from the quarry vet's nutritional guidelines, when I heard the sound of engines. Multiple engines, heavy, diesel. 3 vehicles pulled into the waystation yard. 2 were standard convoy trucks. The third was an armored personnel carrier, with markings I did not recognize, dark livery, no unit designation, a stylized emblem on the door that looked like crossed spears over a coiled serpent. An officer climbed out. Not military exactly, the uniform too sharp, the boots too polished, the bearing too deliberately composed. Private security. Medic Avery. That's me. We're here for the asset, the draconic juvenile. We have a transfer authorization. He held out a document, printed, stamped, carrying a seal I did not recognize. I looked at the document. I looked at the vehicles. I looked at the men climbing out of the personnel carrier, 6 of them in matching dark livery, carrying restraint equipment, chains, a transport crate lined with industrial foam, a sedation kit with a needle the length of my forearm. That's not a command authorization, I said. The seal is wrong. Command uses the Caldera seal. This is something else. The officer's expression did not change. The authorization comes from a private holding interest that has filed a claim on unregistered draconic specimens found in the southern range. The animal has no identification, no lineage record, and no military designation. Under territorial salvage law, unclaimed draconic specimens revert to the nearest registered holding interest. She has a name, I said, and she's not unclaimed, she's my patient. Ma'am, a field medic does not have custodial authority over draconic assets. The transfer is legal. We'll be taking the animal now. Behind me, from inside the clinic, I heard Keithra make a sound. The subvocal vibration, the one from the first day, the one that rattled glass. The men with the restraint equipment glanced at each other. No, I said. I said it the way I had said it to patients who wanted to leave the trauma ward against medical advice. Flat, non-negotiable, a word that did not contain space for discussion. She's under active medical care. The wing membrane has a recent micro-tear under repair. Moving her now, in a transport crate, with sedation I can't verify is safe for her physiology, could cause permanent damage to the regenerating tissue. I won't release a patient into conditions that compromise their recovery. Ma'am, get off my station. The officer stared at me. I stared back. I was 46 years old, 5'6", 130 pounds with my boots on. He had 6 men, 3 vehicles, and a legal document with a seal I didn't recognize. The math was not in my favor. Behind me, Keithra's vibration intensified. The clinic windows hummed. One of the men with the chains took a step back. The authorization, the officer began, is not from my chain of command. File a dispute with Caldera Command if you want. Until I receive a verified order from my commanding officer with the correct seal, this patient stays in my clinic. That's medical protocol, and it's not optional. He left. They all left, in a cloud of diesel and gravel. I stood in the doorway until the sound of the engines faded, and then my knees gave out and I sat down on the step with my hands shaking, and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Keithra appeared in the doorway behind me. She pressed her snout against the back of my neck, the warmest part of her, the throat scales where the radiant heat was strongest, and held it there while my hands stopped shaking. We need help, I said. That night I did not sleep at all. I sat in the doorway of my quarters with the clinic's side door propped open so I could see the access road, and Keithra lay across my lap, all 40 pounds of her, her wings tucked, her head resting on my forearm, her body heat soaking through my trousers and into the bones of my legs. The desert sky was immense and indifferent, the stars sharp as broken glass, and I sat there with a dragon in my lap and a baseball bat from the supply shed leaned against the door frame. And I thought about the choices that accumulate when you're not paying attention. The choice to pull on the gloves, the choice to irrigate the wound, the choice to say easy Keithra easy, the choice to say no to 6 men in dark uniforms, and how each one had been small at the time, barely a decision at all, more like a reflex. And how together they had become a wall I would not let anyone through. I was not the woman who had arrived at waystation 11 months ago. That woman had been running. This one was standing still, with a baseball bat and a dragon, and she was not going anywhere. Corporal Essen came through on convoy the next morning. He had heard about the men in dark livery. Word travels fast through the southern stations, and he stopped by to check. He stood in the examination bay doorway and watched Keithra eat sardines off a plate, and his face went through several expressions before settling on something between alarm and wonder. Medic Avery, that's a Valoran. I did not know the word. A what? A Valoran. Green bronze scales, amber wing veins, gold eyes with the vertical pupil, that particular ratio of wing to body length. She's from the Valoran bloodline. The first clutch line, the Matriarch's own. He said it the way you'd say that the stray you'd been feeding was a lost crown jewel. There are only 11 known Valoran alive. Matriarch keeps a personal census. Every egg is accounted for, every hatchling registered from birth. He looked at Keithra. Keithra looked back at him with the frank disinterest of a creature that had already decided he was not the important person in this room. If she ended up in a ravine behind your fuel dump, something went very wrong. And those men who came for her, private holding interests, don't just file claims on random juveniles. They knew what she was. They came for her specifically. Someone stole her. Someone stole a Valoran egg and lost it. And now they're trying to recover the asset before the Matriarch finds out what happened. Then someone should tell the Matriarch. Someone should have told her 12 days ago. He gave me the frequency, not the military liaison, not the bureaucratic chain I'd been radioing every morning, but the draconic liaison office at Caldera North, a direct channel to the draconic hierarchy's own communication network. A number I found later in the emergency protocol binder filed under interspecies contact. A binder I should have checked on day one and hadn't because I was a field medic, not a diplomat, and nobody had ever told me the two might be the same thing. The liaison officer went quiet for 7 seconds after I gave her the description. "You have a Valoran," she said. "I have a hatchling with green bronze scales and gold eyes and a healed wing that I sutured with silk thread on day one because I didn't have anything else. Her name is Keithra. She eats sardines. She sleeps in my doorway. She is not non-priority. And yesterday, 6 men in dark livery tried to take her with a document carrying a seal I've never seen." A longer silence. Then, "Stay where you are. Do not move. Do not let anyone else near that hatchling. The Matriarch will come to you." The Matriarch arrived on day 14. I heard her before I saw her. The ground shook, a rhythmic percussion that traveled up from the bedrock beneath the clinic's foundation. The overhead lights swayed. A mug walked off the counter and shattered. Keithra, who had been dozing in a patch of sunlight that fell through the examination bay window, lifted her head and made a sound I had never heard her make. A deep, resonant call that vibrated through the building's walls and rattled every loose fitting in the room. She knew. I went outside. The sky was cloudless, bright midday, the sun overhead and the desert floor shimmering. And descending through the heat haze, blotting out a section of sky the size of a cathedral, was the largest living thing I had ever seen. The Matriarch was not merely large. She was a geological event. Her wingspan, fully extended, casting a shadow that swallowed the entire fuel yard and half the access road, must have been 200 feet from tip to tip. Her scales were a deep, burnished gold, so dark they were almost bronze, and where the sun hit the edges of her plates, they threw back a light that was less reflection than emission, as if the scales themselves generated warmth. Her head, as it lowered toward the ground, was the size of a transport truck, and her eyes the same gold as Kithra's, but ancient, layered with centuries of intelligence, and something I could only call jurisdiction, swept the waystation with the careful, comprehensive attention of someone who catalogues every detail and remembers all of it. Behind her, flanking her descent in formation, were 6 dragons. Smaller, still each the size of a barn, in colors ranging from deep emerald to slate gray to a pale, icy blue that caught the sunlight and threw it back as fractured prisms. They landed in a semicircle around the clinic, their wings folding with synchronized precision, their heads lowered in postures of deference. I stood in the doorway of my clinic, and I did not move. The matriarch settled onto the ground with a delicacy that belied her mass. Her claws, each one longer than my arm, touched the earth with the care of someone setting down fine glass. She folded her wings, and then she lowered her head slowly until her enormous eye was level with the clinic door, and she looked at me. Behind me, Kithra chirred, "That 2-note call, there you are." But she was not calling me. She pushed past my legs and walked out into the sunlight on steady legs, 4 good legs, the bruise fully healed, her repaired wing half extended, catching the light, the suture line visible as a thin silver thread against the green-bronze scales. She crossed the 10 feet between the door and the matriarch's lowered head at a trot, and when she reached it, she pressed her snout against the massive jaw and made a sound, not the churr, not the keen, something deeper and older, a frequency I could not hear but could feel in my sternum, and the matriarch's eyes closed. I stood there, a nurse in a dusty clinic in the middle of nowhere, watching a mother find her child. The sound the matriarch made was not a roar or a cry. It was a hum, so low and so vast that it seemed to come from the earth itself, a vibration that traveled through the ground and up through the clinic's foundation and into the walls and into my chest, and into the place where the grief was, and the numbness was, and the reluctance was, and it shook something loose in there, something that had been stuck for 2 years. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. Then the matriarch opened her eyes and looked at me again, not the cataloging assessment of an arriving authority, something personal, something specific. Dragon speech, when directed at a human, is not the subvocal vibration I had been hearing through my walls for 2 weeks. It is projected, a resonance aimed through the air, shaped by vocal plates the size of table tops, arriving with a precision that puts the words inside your head with the clarity of your own thoughts. The matriarch's voice was deep and deliberate and ancient, carrying an accent I had no reference for, the linguistic equivalent of looking at a mountain range, and understanding that it had been there before language existed. "You are the one who stitched her wing." It was not a question. I answered it anyway. "Yes." With human thread. Silk sutures, it was all I had. "And the pain, you managed the pain." Lidocaine, a local anesthetic, I didn't know if it would work. It did. "And the men who came for her." I told them no. The great eye blinked once. "You told 6 armed men no, with no weapon, no authority, and no certainty that you were right." "I was right." "Yes, you were." A pause. "She has a name." "Kithra, I shouldn't have named her. She's yours, She accepted it." I stopped talking. "A Valoran hatchling does not accept a name lightly," the matriarch said. "The name you gave her has been heard. It cannot be taken back. It is part of her now, the way a suture becomes part of the tissue it closes." The great eye held mine. "We searched for her for 19 days. The hatching grounds were raided. 5 eggs were taken. 3 were recovered. 1 was found broken on a mountain road. The 5th, hers, was not found. Until now." 19 days. Kithra had been in the ravine for at least a day before Essen found her. That meant she had hatched alone, possibly inside the wreckage of whatever vehicle had carried the stolen egg, and survived several days in the desert before stumbling into range of waystation 34. A newborn, alone, injured, in the heat. The matriarch read my expression. "You are angry," she said. "Someone stole her. They stole an egg and didn't even yes. I'm angry." "Good." The matriarch's voice carried a weight that went beyond volume. "Anger on behalf of a child is the beginning of devotion." She said it simply, as a statement of observed fact, and it landed in me like a stone dropped into a pond that had been still for too long. The 6 flanking dragons had not moved. Their heads were still lowered, their eyes fixed on the ground, and I realized with a slow, spreading understanding that they were not deferring to the matriarch. They were arranged around me. The formation was centered on the clinic door, and the lowered heads were not submission to their leader. They were acknowledgement of me. "I have a question for you, Leon Avery," the matriarch said, and the use of my full name, which I had never spoken in her presence, which Kithra could not have communicated in any human language, sent a cold line down my spine. "How do you know my name?" "Because she does," a flick of the great gaze toward Kithra. "The bond carries more than warmth. You named her, she knows you." A Valoran who knows her keeper speaks that keeper's name in the resonance, and any dragon within 100 miles will hear it. I thought about the nights when I couldn't sleep, lying on my cot with the hatchling's hum traveling through the wall. I had thought it was the plumbing. It was my name. She had been saying my name every night since I gave her hers. "My question," the matriarch continued. "I have 53 healers in the Valoran domain, dragon-trained, dragon-bred, with access to instruments and medicines your species has not yet conceived of. Each of them would have treated that wing with materials purpose-built for the task, in facilities designed for draconic anatomy, under conditions of controlled warmth and monitored resonance." She paused. The desert wind carried a fine haze of dust between us, and in the silence I could hear Kithra's breathing, steady and calm, pressed against the matriarch's jaw. And not one of them would have slept beside her door. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. "You were not built for this work," the matriarch said. "You were built for your own kind in your own clinics with your own tools. You did not want this patient. Your logs say as much. I can read your reluctance in the shape of your early entries, in the clinical distance you maintained, in the way you wrote the hatchling for 4 days before you wrote Kithra. You came to it unwilling. You stayed because the need was in front of you and you could not walk past it. That is not skill. That is character. And character is the only credential the Valoran have ever recognized." Kithra opened her eyes and looked at me from across the yard. "That 2-note call, there you are." "I am offering you a place," the matriarch said. "Not a posting, not a rotation, a place. In the domain among the Valoran as Kithra's keeper, her healer, her guardian, her name-giver. The domain's healers will teach you what you do not know. Kithra will teach you what they cannot. And in return, you will be what you have already been for 14 days, the person who did not walk past." I looked at the clinic behind me. The dusty supply cabinet, the examination table with the dark stain where the blood had dripped on day 1. The closet with the blanket nest that Kithra hadn't used in a week because she preferred my doorway. 11 months of holding pattern, of waiting for a transfer back to the real work, of filling the hours so the hours wouldn't fill me. I looked at Kithra. 40 pounds of mottled green bronze, gold eyes, a silver suture line on her wing that I had sewn with thread meant for human skin. A child who had been stolen and broken and left behind, and who had decided, with the terrifying certainty of a creature that does not second-guess its own instincts, that I was the one who would stay. I looked at the matriarch. "I don't know how to be a dragon keeper," I said. "You have been one for 14 days. I took a breath. The desert air tasted of dust and fuel, and beneath it, something I could not name, a warmth that was more than temperature, a frequency that was more than sound, the resonance that Kithra carried in her bones and had been broadcasting through my walls since the first night, saying my name to anyone who could hear it. "Then I'll stay," I said. The matriarch inclined her head, a gesture so slight I almost missed it, a nod that carried the weight of centuries. The 6 flanking dragons lifted their heads in unison, and the sound they made together was not a roar or a call, but a sustained, harmonic tone that rose into the desert sky and kept rising, spreading, filling the air above Waystation 34 with a vibration that shook the heat haze apart and turned the sky from white to a clear, ringing blue. Kithra pressed against my leg and chirred. The logbook I filed that evening was the last one I ever wrote at Waystation 34. It was also the shortest. Patient Kithra Valoran bloodline green bronze juvenile approximately 4 weeks post-hatch. Wing membrane, healed 12 silk sutures 1 microtear repaired full regeneration complete. Forelimb laceration, closed full-scale regrowth. Hind leg contusion, resolved. Appetite, robust. Temperament, I paused over the word, then wrote it devoted. Keeper Leon Avery, Field Medic, Waystation 34. Status, transferred. Destination, Valoran Domain. Prognosis, she'll fly before the month is out. I closed the book. I turned off the light, and I walked out into the evening where Kithra was waiting, her wings half spread in the last warm light of the day, practicing the motion that would carry her, carry us both, somewhere I had never planned to go. I had come to Waystation 34 because I was running from grief. I had stayed because a bleeding hatchling was put in front of me and I could not look away. And now I was leaving because a dragon with gold eyes and a churr like a question had done the one thing I could not do for myself. She had given me a reason to stay somewhere. The desert was quiet. The stars were coming out. Somewhere in my chest, in the place where the numbness had lived for 2 years, something had taken root, small and warm and persistent, and it was not grief, and it was not duty, and it was not the professional distance of a medic doing her job. It was the thing that happens when you stitch a wound you were never trained to stitch, and name a creature you were never meant to name, and discover, 14 days into a job you didn't want, that the job has become the truest thing you've ever done. The matriarch was right. Anger on behalf of a child is the beginning of devotion. I know that now.